Welcome to the Inside Story podcast, where we explore the path to self-awareness, personal growth, and ultimately joyful living. I'm your host, Esha Oberoi, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey of self-discovery. Each episode, we bring you experts, thought leaders, and inspiring individuals who will share their inside stories to help you navigate the challenges of life. Whether you're a team player, a leader, or a CEO, our podcast is designed to provide you with the tools, knowledge, and inspiration to bring your best self to life every day. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome our special guest for today's episode, Fel Zsha Mirzze. Fel is a registered counsellor with the Australian Counselling Association and has a degree in Social Science and Counselling. Fel provides tangible advice with a compassionate approach to help people really lead their life's goals. So Fel, I know part of the discussion today, we're going to be touching on post-traumatic growth, but maybe let's just start with your background. How did you fall into counselling?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast today. So initially, how I started out in counselling was I had started to do a degree in law, and then unfortunately my father became quite unwell with a terminal diagnosis. And that kind of changed my career path, so to speak, because at that point in time, remote learning wasn't available for nearly every subject as it is now. So that's been a big change in the educational sector, which has been great for a lot of people. But that meant I was kind of limited to the courses that I could undertake from home because I wanted to balance caring for my dad and also still continuing, my educational pursuits. So I looked at what was available and social science came up, and I thought, hey, that looks really, really interesting. And I guess, social science and counselling go pretty much hand in hand with a lot of the things that you learn. And then that led to me, learning about counselling and then moving into the mental health space, basically. And from there, I've done a lot of crisis work, started out working in a pilot program. That was like a crisis drop-in centre, and that was in Sydney. So that was really hard and fast learning in the very start of my career. And since then, I've also done homeless outreach. I've done a lot of suicide intervention and crisis work to do with suicide intervention. And now I'm in private practice. And through my private practice, I work with a lot of victims of trauma and a lot of domestic violence and victims of crime as well.
Okay, Phil, that's a really good background. Thank you for sharing that. Let's start with trauma as the definition of trauma. How do you define trauma, and what are some examples of trauma that you see in your practice?
We see a lot of PTSD from domestic violence is probably the main presentation that we get, and that can be anything from, stalking, harassment, to a combination of both of those things, plus the physical aspect where we get a high number of strangulations and physical abuse, and not just towards intimate partners, but also the ramifications that has on the children as well. So it can be a whole trauma response for a family collectively, basically. And it's the emotional response that we get to a distressing experience. So what's distressing for one person may not be for another. It's how the person perceives that distressing event that determines the level of trauma that they're subsequently going to have. So it's really dependent on the psychological reaction. So one person may experience, for example, a car accident, and another person will experience the same car accident, but their perception of that incident can be very different. So it's good to keep in mind that everyone's perception and experience of trauma is very individual.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. And I think that's a really good point, because I think often we believe that, trauma is, or we define it or think of it as something that's like needs to be massive. But I also don't think that it needs to be huge. Sometimes what we think in the moment is an insignificant accident or incident that happens in our life. Later on in our life, we experience something that triggers it reminds us of it. And it's so these things don't have to be huge, but they can have, yeah, like you said, this very unique internal response that we end up having from it.
Most definitely. Yeah, that's correct.
With trauma, like, how does someone know that they've got it? Like, how does someone go through the experience of, oh, this might actually be, post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, so
my body.
I would always recommend that people go and see, the clinical psych, or that they go and see a psychiatrist that is equipped to diagnose them with these things first and foremostly. But if you're just looking at things that are going on for you and thinking, hey, this is a question I might want to raise with my treating professional, it can be anything from nightmares, so disturbances in the night, waking up from having, severe nightmares or night terrors, as we call them. You can get somatic responses, shaking, crying, sweating, flashbacks triggered by certain things like memories, visuals that come back to us. If we hear, see, taste, or smell something that brings back a vivid memory for us, and we feel a level of disturbance within our system, that's also another sign. Mood dysregulation, if you feel like, hey, my mood hasn't really been that great lately, or it's been very up and down, that can also be another sign. And also too, we can experience reactions to certain situations we wouldn't ordinarily. So you might think, oh, I'm a bit snappy, or my temper is quite short in comparison to how it used to be. That can be also a sign that something is not right. And I think if we look at the whole sphere of wellness and we dissect every part of that, so how's my eating? Is my eating, has it changed? Am I eating more? Am I eating less? Does that intertie into what's going on for me mentally at the moment? Am I keeping up with my social engagements? Do I still want to go outside of the house and hang out with friends, or watch a movie with my friends, or spend time with family? Or am I isolating? Am I withdrawing? Like I said before, the sleep. How's my sleep? Because if our sleep is not great, lack of sleep ties into mood. So these things all tie into each other. Also looking at, it's always really important when we have any kind of symptoms that are outside the ordinary, even if we perceive they might just be mental health related, it's always good to go and get a full blood count, test all our levels. Am I deficient in certain vitamins? Do I need a little bit more sun? How's my vitamin D levels? Because that's related to your immunity, how often you become unwell. So these things all tie into each other. And am I doing my self-care regimen? Do I need to be doing a little bit more exercise? Do I need to be meditating? So if you look at all of those spheres and you see that your scoring in those areas are very different to how they were previously, prior to the traumatic event, it's an indicator that definitely something might be going on for you, and it's good to go and speak to somebody about your concerns, or about how you can get back up to that, that homeostasis, or that level of functioning that you were at prior. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. I often ask myself this question, and again, this is just because of the amount of self-work I've done on my own healing in my journeys. Am I feeling like myself? Just being in tune with, am I still myself in a way? I'll share something quite personal. I went through this was my 5th pregnancy, which landed unfortunately in a miscarriage. And I very quickly felt that I had overcome that. I thought, it's a miscarriage, and we know how common miscarriages can be. So I very quickly, over the months of that experience, did everything I could to get over it, right? Because that's what we generally do. And I think that's what society pushes us to do. And it was only 1.5 years later where I started to experience muscle tension in specific parts of my body. And I was like, this is so abnormal for me. What is going on? And for a period of time, I ignored it. I thought, oh, it will get better. I'll be fine. It's probably something that's temporary. And then it's only when it persisted, I thought, no, I need to go and see someone. I need to go and see a specialist around this. So I went to a number of specialists until I finally actually went to a clinical psychologist who would also treat in terms of the physicality. So she used to specialize in muscle trauma.
Mhm.
And anyway, she took me through a series of questions, and what she determined was exactly this, that she diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress. And there was a part of my body, because of the miscarriage, it almost had secured or held onto the tension and the trauma of that experience. And so I think, like, we really don't realize that how we carry on experiences as emotional blockages, almost even in our physicality, right?
Yeah, look, that's a really good point that you make, Esha, and I just want to say thank you for sharing that very personal story. And I'm really sorry that you had to go through that experience, first and foremostly. So the body and the mind are one. We like to think of them as separate, but I like to think of them as one. And I also like to push that we know our bodies better than anyone else. So you are an expert in your own body and in yourself. So when your body is giving you signals or signs, whether that's through pain, muscle tension, or whatever it might be, it's your body saying, hey, I need some help with this. There's something not right here. So it's a way of us sending signals to ourselves, and we have to listen to those signals. Otherwise, we'll get to a point where we can become really unwell. So, there's a saying that the universe whispers to you before it shouts. So this is our body giving us little whispers saying, hey, putting its hand up, hey, I need a bit of help with this. There's something not right here within our system. And what you're describing is a somatic response to an emotional trauma, which then, goes back to what I said about the brain and the body being connected. And the more time that we spend with introspection and doing, meditation and sitting in quietness with ourselves, and practicing mindfulness, that's how we can better understand and be more attuned to our bodies, because that way we're able to read these signals a lot better, because our mind and our body are feeling more connected and more at one. And that way we can really have a good body scan of everything that's going on for us. A good technique that people can use if they're wondering, hey, am I, having a somatic response to this, is, if they have a traumatic memory that comes up or an imagery that comes up for them, to close their eyes and do a body scan. So starting from the very top of the body, in a quiet environment, just doing a scan of your body from the scalp down to the eyes, to the nose, to the breathing, to the chest, and then all the way down to the bottom. And if they're feeling any kind of sensations in certain parts of the body, it's a good indicator that there's a somatic response there and that trauma is stuck. And if these things stay stuck within our system, we can push them down, and we can continue to cope. And that's what society essentially wants us to do, is to continue to cope. But if we do that and we push that down, it will crack out eventually. It's going to crack out in ways that we're not going to be able to control. So chronic illness, terminal illness, immunity disorders, it can crack out in addiction, and also like things that are not really seen as addiction, but can be perceived as addiction. Workaholics, spending all your time at work to try and put that trauma to the side, to cope, drinking, drug use, etc., gambling. So the trauma will crack out, and we're not really sure how or when, but it will if we continue to push down that response that we're having and not work through it.
Phil, we addressed definition of trauma, examples of trauma. And so in my case, it was actually a physical response, and the muscle needed to relearn how to work because it had become numb because of the trauma, the tension had got stuck. Then there's the emotional part that you spoke about, which then translates into potentially addiction or overeating, working too much, etc. These are all really, good signs that we can pay attention to if we just stop, pause, and pay attention to these extreme behaviors, numbing out or overdoing it. Yeah. How do we then move into that mindset or space of growth? So you use a term, post-traumatic growth. Can you tell us about that, and how do you shift a person who's gone through trauma, is aware of these behaviors, and now wants to go into growth and healing?
Yeah, Sure. So a lot of people hear the term post-traumatic stress disorder, and when I bring up post-traumatic growth, they're quite surprised and they say, oh, what is this? Because it's another way of thinking or another avenue for people to take, as opposed to just getting the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and then believing that they've got this label for the rest of their life. And the word disorder also has a lot of, connotations to it that can be perceived as quite negative. And that's not really helpful when people have already been through a really negative traumatic event. So I guess in short, post-traumatic growth is turning pain into purpose. So in regards to that, it's seeing what levels of growth and new learnings can come out of a traumatic experience. Of course, we need to be doing all our self-care, speaking with our therapist, and sometimes even there is, a medical intervention in respect to different medications, vitamins, etc., that people need to be having in conjunction with their treatment. So I guess following a trauma, you can see positive growth afterwards, meaning that trauma itself is not what facilitates the growth, but how the individual deals with the highly challenging life circumstances that follow. And that's what determines, that person's level of growth. It looks at what we do with the trauma we've experienced and what we do from the learnings from that experience that follows. Yeah.
If we were to wrap it all up, what are 3 strategies that you can provide today to our listeners that they could implement? They're just, self-directed strategies that they can do themselves. What are some tools you can give away?
Sure. So if somebody's looking at post-traumatic growth, it's good to do mindfulness, and that looks different for everyone. Personally, myself, I ask my clients to design a self-care regimen that works for them. So I have some clients that can sit for half an hour and do a guided meditation. I have some that can only sit for 5 minutes, but studies show that it's not the amount of time, it's the consistency. So if you can only manage 5 to 10 minutes a day, by all means, try and get that done daily. Like, use your self-care regimen as like a script, as though a doctor had given it to you and said, this is the medicine you need to have every day. And I always say that the formula for wellness is not easy, but it is simple, if that makes sense. So it may not be easy to get up every day and do these things, but it is simple. So moving daily, getting enough sunlight, keeping a healthy diet, doing your mindfulness, doing something that fills your cup. And that might be talking on the phone with friends. It might be reading a book. So doing things that work for you and that fill your cup are really, really important, and looking after the whole body, so I think that's the main takeaway.
Yeah, thank you, Fel. That's been so useful. And it is really all those simple things, right? We overcomplicate our life, but it drills down to those very basic, simple things that our body and our mind need, that attention and that emotional awareness that, gets built up from the mindfulness practices. Thank you, Fel. I really appreciate your time. And thank you to all our listeners who joined us today. We hope today's episode has provided you with valuable insights, strategies, and inspiration to enhance your life. Taking control of our physical and mental health is a journey in this very, very noisy world, and it requires true intention and practice. So I hope you can stay tuned for upcoming episodes where we'll continue to explore together how we create a community that is more centered on leading a purposeful life and work. Thank you again for being part of the podcast today.
Thank you. Take care.